A few weeks ago, I did a video where I went through all of my TBR, physical TBR on my bookshelves, and I've come to realize how many books I have, but also it kind of reminded me a little bit of some of the goals that I have as a reader, some of the things that I want to experience as a reader, what I want to study, what I want to look into a little bit more. And one of those things that it kind of reminded me of was that I really want to get more in depth into French literature. So this video is me doing exactly that. For the next 2 weeks, I'm going to be reading French literature, and I'm going to be reading from two authors who are very different but also very influential writers, and have contributed significantly to French literature but also to global literature in general. I did a tiny bit of research on the authors so that we can have a little bit of a conversation and not just me sitting here and be like, oh, I like this book, oh, I didn't like this book. Like, obviously there's going to be some of that, but also I wanted to take the time to read a little bit about these authors and see exactly what they contributed with, some of their innovations, what are some of the things they studied and they looked at. And so I'm thinking to maybe make this in a little bit of a series where I try to delve a little bit deeper in the literature of a specific culture, a specific country, and I read a couple of authors from that country, but also we sit down and we really discuss a little bit what those authors did. So for today's video, we're going to be discussing Honoré de Balzac and Jules Verne. These two writers were very different in the types of books they were writing and the types of genres they were looking into, but they did have a small period of time in which they coexisted. So I'm just looking here at my notes. So Honoré de Balzac was from 1799 up until 1850, whereas Jules Verne was born in 1828 and he passed away in 1905. So it almost seems as if Jules Verne was one literary generation away from Honoré de Balzac. Before I tell you the books that I want to read from these two authors, let me tell you a little bit about them and kind of what they brought into the literary scene. So let's first start with Balzac. The information that I'm going to be talking about in this video is all derived from the Cambridge Companion to Balzac. So that's where I got this information. And obviously, I'm no authority figure in any way, shape, or form on Balzac or Jules Verne for that matter. So everything I say in this video is just basically my experience trying to learn about both of them. It's not me telling you anything that you should take without a grain of salt. So if you want to double check for yourself the information I'm sharing with you, you can go visit that specific book. So Honoré de Balzac on a global scene is actually considered to be one of the founding fathers of literary realism. To my understanding, he tried to kind of write in such a way that the collection of his works would eventually be able to portray and create a sort of map of the social world, and obviously with particular interest into French society and French culture. So this collection of works is actually his masterpiece. It's called La Comédie Humaine, and it contains over 90 pieces of literature, of novels. I think most of them are novels, but I could be wrong, where he tried to get at different angles of society and explain society. These 90 works are divided within three categories. So we have les études des mœurs, les études philosophiques, and les études analytiques. I'm just gonna read this from my notes because this is actually a quote from the Cambridge Companion to Balzac, where they basically describe what his ambition was as a writer, and I found that they really wrote it so perfectly that I wanted to read you that quote. It says his ambition was to classify human types like species in the animal kingdom. He really looked into portraying French society in all its possible complexities and details. He was looking into people, he was looking into locations, into politics, manners, money, everything that could contribute to how we look at a culture and we say, oh yeah, that's French. He tried to portray that in his works. So from a literary perspective, Balzac is considered to be a realist because he inspired a lot of future writers to start writing from a perspective that it's more grounded in reality, that does not really idealize a lot of the things that are idealized in novels and poetry in particular. But very ironically, I also found that there are a lot of things in his novels that are reminiscent of the Romantic period, where although most of the things that he is examining remain very grounded in reality, some of the things he still likes to idealize. And one of those specific things that he likes to portray as more idealistic is love. And I think that will be perfectly portrayed in the book that I'm going to be picking up from him, La Fausse Maîtresse. This is a very short work about a Count Laginski who gets married to a very beautiful countess from France. And following their wedding, they both move into Paris together and they stay at this beautiful hotel that they own. When their life seems perfect, enters the scene Paz, who is Count Laginski's best friend. But there's a little bit of a weird dynamic between them because Paz actually keeps track of all of Count Laginski's financial business. And it also seems that Paz may have some romantic interest in our countess. I'll be talking about this book a little bit more in detail later on in this video, so stay tuned. But for now, let's move on to our second author, Jules Verne. So what Jules Verne is really renowned for is his work in speculative fiction. And we don't have a lot of works, I would say, in contemporary times that are going under the umbrella of the genre speculative fiction. But the reason why I use these two words to characterize Jules Verne's work is because actually science fiction wasn't really a big thing. It was literally just at the beginnings being influenced and nurtured by authors like Jules Verne. A lot of his works are very adventurous, and in all of these works, he blended scientific discovery, scientific curiosity, technology in a way that, again, was grounded in reality. So he was trying to explain some of these scientific discoveries of the century, but also he was trying to speculate where the future could lead us based on these discoveries and these technologies that they had in those days. Just like Balzac, he also had his own masterpiece of series where he had a collection of works, and this series is called Les Voyages Extraordinaires. What's interesting about Jules Verne is that his contemporary literary critics were actually very harsh on a lot of his work. He was not recognized as an accomplished writer back in the day because a lot of people thought that his works were kind of children's play. A lot of his work seemed to really only focus on escapism, and people thought that there was not really a lot of substance, literary value in his works. And it's funny because nowadays we read them and it's actually very valuable for us to understand where people in that society were in terms of technology. I'm going to read you a quote from a book that I consulted on Jules Verne that was edited by Timothy A. Unwin, and he said that, like so many of his contemporaries, he writes in the ample shadow of Balzac. But it is time when experiment, reflection about fiction, consideration of its uses and its abuses, theorizations of its relationship to the so-called real world, and problematization of the ways in which the narrative relates knowledge are particularly intense. I found this quote really interesting and I wanted to mention it because it automatically compares the two authors that I'm going to be reading from, where they both seem to be really concerned with the idea of reality or explaining the real world. Is just that one did it through the lens of society and the other one did it through the lens of technology and science. The book that I'm picking up from Jules Verne is indeed from the collection of Voyages Extraordinaires, and it's going to be Mille, lieues sous les mers. It is half eaten on the spine, this beautiful book, because my beautiful little corgi dog thought that this was the most delectable afternoon snack that he could have. So that's why the spines are looking like this. Basically, in this book, we are following mostly a professor who gets swept up in an expedition to go figure out and try to find this monster that is said to terrorize the oceans. There's been weird sightings of a huge monster whose skin is almost metallic, and nobody knows what species it is, nobody knows what it could do, if it's dangerous, and so they go on this expedition to try to figure out where this monster is and possibly take it out. And obviously things don't go so well when they find the monster, and the monster is in fact a submarine. They are are thrown off board and they get captured by the people in the submarine, and essentially they are not allowed to leave the submarine. So they become kind of captives there. I'm currently reading the book, so I can tell you a little bit of some of the details that are already happening. There's so much science in here. He literally goes and explores every single detail of the logistics of how a submarine is possible. Where does the air come from for people to breathe on board? How is it able to sustain so much pressure? There's also talks about the marine life and fauna and flora of oceans. It's honestly marvelous so far, and I can't wait to finish it and give you more thoughts. I think this is it for now. I will get back to you when I finish reading the books and we have more to chat about. Hello, we are back. The clip that you just watched was actually filmed longer than a month ago. Life got a little bit crazy and I couldn't film, but we're back. I didn't want to scrap this whole video idea, even though it's been longer than a month that I've read these books, because I really wanted to talk about these books and I really wanted to explore more French literature. So bear with me. I'm trying to remember all the details from the book and how I felt about them a month ago, but my memory is not the best, so we're just gonna do our best. Let's start by talking about La Fausse Maîtresse by Honoré de Balzac. I read this one in one sitting because it's very, very short. I read it on a long-ish car ride. It was a weird little book. Both of these books, unfortunately, did not hit the spot for me, but I still think there are very interesting aspects of these books in a literary historical sense that are nice to think about and nice to explore and talk about. But from a perspective of a reader just trying to enjoy some new books, it was not the best reading experience, to be completely honest. So let me give you a bit of a synopsis. I think I told you a little bit about the book last time, but essentially we are following Count Adam Laginski, who falls in love with Clémentine, who is a French aristocratic, beautiful lady. They both move in together in a beautiful hotel in Paris, and they live their seemingly perfect life. Enters the scene Paz, who is Count Laginski's best friend. We get to learn that they have a little bit of a weird dynamic. So Paz is actually in charge of all of Count Laginski's financial business, and their relationship just gave me very weird vibes when I read about them, and that gets uncovered a little bit in the book. I'll talk a little bit about that. Essentially what ends up happening is that Paz falls for Clémentine, for his best friend's wife. He becomes this kind of imperfect hero of the story where he kind of decides to go on a self-sacrificing journey because he's trying so much to make sure that his best friend and Clémentine don't find out that he actually has a thing for her. He decides to invent himself a fake mistress, La Fausse Maîtresse, basically the name of the story. And he does all of these acrobatics to just trying to convince them that he is in love with this other woman when nobody really asked, like no one cares. So the story itself felt very random. Like everything was very random. But now that I sat down and I thought a little bit about the book and I also did a little bit of research, I kind of understand like all the pieces that Balzac was trying to fit in. From a reading perspective, was not very enjoyable. Anyways, let's talk about some of the interesting social aspects that this novel conveys. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video that Balzac was really focused on creating kind of a map of French society. That was his main literary goal. And when you read this book, it is very striking that two of the main characters are not actually French. So both Count Adam Laginski and his best friend Paz are actually Polish. Initially, I thought that Balzac did that just because he wanted to have a different culture against which he could compare French culture, but I did a little bit more research, and most probably what happened here is actually Balzac drew on his own personal life, because him as a French man, he married a Polish aristocratic woman. And so this is deeply personal to Balzac. It comes from a probably personal interest in examining this relationship with Polish culture, and specifically against the backdrop of uprising against Russia that happened in the 1830s, I believe, where a lot of Polish people had to flee Poland and had to seek refuge somewhere else, France being one of those locations. And so what I read about this book a little bit more in detail through a couple of scholars who study Balzac is that he tried to basically showcase how they were perceived by the French society, and specifically high French society. And he did so with two very different characters. Adam is seen as this person who kind of surrenders to French society and French nobility, which Balzac tries to kind of portray as very superficial. French society as being very hollow, as not having its own kind of substance. Adam is essentially the person who surrenders, just sort of superficiality, because he wants to be seen as part of French society, as opposed to Paz, who is someone who is much more stoic, who seems to portray a lot more honor in his Polish background, military background in particular. So they're kind of the two opposing sides of the Polish exiles at the time, essentially arguing that those who are willing to surrender to French superficiality will be viewed in a positive light, whereas those who hold on to their core values might not be as accepted in society. And in fact, Paz, although is one of the main characters in the story, he's always on the sidelines and he does not really get things to be his way, although he does a whole lot of sacrificing. What I wanted to point out a little bit earlier regarding the sort of sacrifice that Paz does, where we get to unravel a bit more his relationship with Adam, is the fact that Adam is someone who kind of is very frivolous with his money, is not very careful with his money, gambles a lot of his money, his finances, his businesses away, and Paz always kind of comes after him and just clears everything out, and he takes the blame upon himself so that Clémentine is not mad at his friend. And following along with this discussion of the superficiality of the high class of French society is also further examined through the fake mistress, and we get to see a level of commodification of the lower classes for the benefit of the higher classes. And I think this is mostly seen through the perspective of the fake mistress that Paz hires. Her wants, her desires are not really of interest here, and they're not kind of relevant, because all she is really just a pawn for Paz to use in his scheme. All of the ways in which Paz is buying her by paying her rent or paying her various beautiful garments is kind of describing the way in which high society views lower society as just some things that could be used in certain personal agendas. So this is kind of everything that I have to say about this book. Thought it was interesting. It was interesting to learn about Balzac. I'm really happy I did that. I do have another one of his works on my shelves. I have Le Père Goriot, which I believe is his most famous work. So I am excited to actually read that one. I think that one will be maybe just a little bit better, but I am happy that I read my first Balzac. We are moving on to this one. I can never say the title of this freaking book. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I think that's the translated proper version. So I gave you a little bit of a synopsis on this one the other time, so I'll just briefly kind of go through it to make sure that I didn't leave out any details. We are set in the later part of the 1800s, and the whole entire world is going in a little bit of a panic because we think that there's a monster out there. There's this huge monster that have been seen in certain parts of the globe that is coming from the sea or from the ocean, and people are getting scared because it's a monster that is different from any other animal that we know of, and so people are concerned about safety. And so the US government decides to put together a crew of very highly educated people who may be able to find this monster and also study it or eventually neutralize it if it's necessary. So they all hop on the Abraham Lincoln ship, and we follow, the whole crew, but the main characters in this crew that are of importance are Professor Aronnax, who is a marine biologist, and then we have his very loyal companion Conseil, and then there's a third character who they meet on board called Ned Land, and he is a Canadian, I don't know how to say this word, harpooner, those people that kill animals basically. And they start to kind of lose hope a little bit because they can't find the monster anywhere, until one day obviously they meet the grand monster and a battle ensues, and our three main characters that I just named earlier actually fall off board and they are captured by the monster. Obviously it's not a real monster, it's the submarine, but they're captives now. They're not allowed to leave the submarine. We get introduced to Nemo, who is the captain of the Nautilus, which is the submarine in question. And essentially, we follow many, many, many months. Is it years? I don't remember. It could have been years. But we follow a long period of time where our three main protagonists, alongside Nemo and the crew of the Nautilus, go around the world and they explore various marine locations in the world. There's also a little bit of a mystery, and we get to uncover some secrets, which I'm not going to mention in case you want to read the story for yourself. But essentially, it's just an adventure story going across the world, various locations, various seas, various oceans of the world, and exploring them. I much more enjoy talking about this book and thinking about this book than the actual reading experience. What I'm going to say, this book was a bit boring. I think the reason why it was boring to me was because I come to this with a very contemporary perspective and experience of a reader, where we are so used to having a lot of instant gratification in books. We're constantly looking for twists or just very intense moments in the plot line. And this book, the majority of it is quite quiet. I would like to call this a taxonomy of submarine life on Earth. It has some fantastical elements, but it also has a lot of scientific elements. We get so much information about marine life in various locations of the world. We get descriptions of mathematics and physics and just the physical challenges of creating a submarine in terms of pressure, how air gets circulated in such a small space. So those are all very interesting to think about, but when you sit and you just read pages upon pages of the same structure, it does get a little bit boring. At least it did for me. All that being said, I love thinking about the sublime characterization of the natural world and specifically of the underwater kingdom. So we see a lot of this through the eyes of the captain of the ship, Nemo, who is someone who has a little bit of a grudge on society and on Earth and people on Earth. He basically does not want to ever return back to Earth, is constantly living in the sea or in oceans, and the sea basically becomes the self-sufficient space where everything that he needs to survive on the ship he can get from the sea. I am a huge lover of the natural world and of animals in particular, and so to me, thinking about that is really cool, and I like that. I also really like just the character of the captain of Nemo in particular. He is presented as this very gray character, very complex character. Earlier novels and earlier works kind of portrayed people as a little bit one-sided. So they had certain characteristics and this is who they were. They were either a good person or a bad person. Whereas here, Captain Nemo in particular is someone who is clearly a good person at heart. We see some deep moments when, one of his crew members gets sick and how he reacts to that and how deeply he cares for the people that he loves. At the same time, he captures three poor innocent people from the sea and does not allow them to ever leave his submarine. So he has some very kind of gray character moments, and I really love the examination of who he was. I will have to say this book did not conclude certain characteristics of who he is as a person, which really annoyed me because I feel like his character was kind of building up to something really grand, and then the book ended and we don't know certain mysterious aspects of his personality, of who he is. I read online that his story actually continues in another novel, so maybe that's why. Maybe Jules Verne was like trying to keep us all interested, though I don't know if I like that idea that now I just have to read a whole entirely new story just to find out more information about his character. Anyways, this is all I had to say about this. It was not my favorite read. I've read Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne previously, which I really enjoyed. And I think I enjoyed it more because it was really faster paced. Well, thank you for joining me and staying until the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making it, and I will for sure make this into a series. I loved reading a little bit more in depth about these stories and really getting myself more familiarized with the impact, the literary, historical impact of these works and these authors. That was really interesting, and it's something that when I have the time, I would definitely love to do more of. So thank you for joining me. I hope you're having a lovely day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.